My name's Greg Oliver. I'm glad that y'all are in here. Since we're kind of in a compact space, I'll just sort of stay close and just walk over here when I need to change slides. But I have an organization called Awaken, and I'll just spend the first couple minutes telling you about what we do and why that's what I do, and then why Al asked me to come talk about sexuality. So Awaken is a nonprofit that my wife Stacy and I started in 2015, and our purpose is to help and offer support and resources for men and women, couples, and church leaders who are trying to walk through issues involving sexual brokenness, whether that be sexual or pornography addiction, infidelity recovery, you name it. Where our sexuality has come under attack or we've experienced brokenness, and we're trying to walk through that into healing and freedom. And the reason why I have a ministry like that, and my wife and I are doing that, is because it's an expression of my story. Prior to doing this, for about 15 years, I was a worship and music pastor in one church in Lake Charles, Louisiana, and then at another church in Birmingham for about 11 years. And so a total of 15 years. And the whole time that I was doing that, the whole first 17 years of my marriage to Stacy, the whole time I was in Bible college, the whole time I was in Christian high school, I was struggling with hidden sexual struggles and sin. And I never told anybody about it because I didn't think I could tell anybody about it. Since I've been in recovery, since 2009, God has shown me, and I've learned an awful lot about what was driving a lot of that behavior. I've realized that it wasn't as simple as, well, you're just a guy who does terrible things, you must be a terrible guy. It wasn't about that at all. There was a lot of brokenness in other ways that I was trying to carry and trying to manage on my own. And the way that I try to get relief from those things started way back when I was 11 years old, and I'm 51 now. So it started 40 years ago when I learned that there was this thing called masturbation that I could use to alleviate all the stress and anxiety in my life. And I didn't realize it was going to take me as far down a really harmful road as it did. And so, you know, my life was a series of lists of things that I'm not going to do. Well, I'm doing this, but I'm not going to do that. And then I do that. Well, I did that, but I'm not going to do that. Well, once... And you know what I mean. You know, it's like my whole journey is looking back at line after line after line that I said I'd never cross, but eventually did. And so all of this stuff was going on while I was trying to juggle faith and marriage and parenthood and ministry. And, you know, this secret part of my life that I was concealing from everybody, except I knew God knew about it, but only He and I knew about it. It was so inconsistent and incongruent with every other part of my life. And I just had this deep belief that if anybody ever knew about it, found out my secret, that my life would be over. There would be no coming back from this. And so I was just determined that I was going to take this secret to my grave. And I was starting to become convinced in the late 2000s that it wasn't going to probably take all that long. I had just all that despair that Al was talking about at the beginning of the session in there. I mean, that was just the benchmark of my life, was despair. I was 38 years old, and I thought, I just need to try to run out the clock. And that's either going to be a really miserable, long run out of the clock, or it's going to be an early grave for me. I didn't know which it was going to be, but neither of them sounded good. But I thought, it's out of my hands, because the only thing I can do to change it is let somebody know, and that's the one thing I can't do. So I had spent years trying to understand it. I had spent years praying that God would take it away. I spent a little bit of time praying that God would take my life. And then finally I started praying that God would just cause me to get caught. And before you think, oh, what a brave dude, that's not what it was about. There's one thing about addictive mindset. One thing that people say about the addict brain is that it is ruled by insanity. And the insanity that I had going on in my addict brain was I was trying to manipulate God. because there's a lot of manipulation that goes along with that kind of brokenness too. And I thought, well, when I prayed that He'd fix me, He didn't do that. When I prayed that He'd kill me, He didn't do that. So if I pray that He'll cause me to get caught, maybe God will say, whoa, that dude's serious. Greg's a pretty good guy. I think I'll just fix him. You know, I'll answer that first prayer. Like, I'm trying to play coercive mind games with God. That's how far my insanity had gone. Well, God took me at my literal word, and He caused me to get caught. Unfortunately and fortunately, people refer to things like what happened to me in January of 2009 as the best, worst day of your life. And mine was January 6th, 2009. I was exposed because somebody that was an acting out partner had left an email window open on their computer, and a family member had seen it, and they'd called the church where I worked and turned me in, and it's out. And so everything that I was absolutely terrified was going to happen, happened, but not everything. Because I thought, well, if I get caught, I'll get fired, my reputation will be ruined, I'll lose friends, my marriage will be over, I'll destroy my life, I'll be alone. Well, a few of those things happened, but some of those things didn't happen. And instead of being alone for the rest of my life, I actually experienced something I never ever thought would happen. And that was that people started coming to me and saying, hey, I've been through something like that too, and I'll be here for you. Like, if you want to talk about it, like, I get it. I'm like, no, you don't know what I did. And then they would tell me what they did. I'm like, you do know what I did, you know? And I didn't have a box to put this thing in where you would just talk about it like you're talking about the score of the ball game, you know? But these were people that, like, I was still in my crater. They had been in their crater, but they weren't in the crater anymore. But what they were doing is they were using their story to help somebody who was at square one. And so I began to walk away from despair, and I began to experience hope, which I never ever thought that I'd have. I'd been a Christian since I was 6 years old, but I hadn't been experiencing the joy of my salvation really through any of that. And now at 38, I, for the very first time in my life, was experiencing life without a secret. I was experiencing somebody would ask me a question, and I would just answer without having to think first, what does my answer need to be? Guys, my mental sharpness was through the roof because it had to be. Because when somebody would ask me a question, I would think, now what lie have I told that I don't need to contradict, and what plan do I have that I don't need to mess up? And like, I could go through that in like a half a second and then like give the answer that I needed to give. And all of a sudden I didn't have to do that anymore. And it just felt so relaxing and so free. And I began to go to therapy. I began to discover what sexual addiction was all about and how it had developed and what had driven it. And I just got so much of a deeper understanding into my story, which really helped with the shame that I was feeling. And I just had a whole new life back. And so I wanted to get back into church ministry because I thought that, like, if I could have this beautiful redemption story and be back on stage leading worship again, then, like, oh, what a wonderful, beautiful testimony. Like, I can see it, God. Like, I see your plan. It's all charted out. And so after a couple of years, I started pursuing that, and those doors just didn't open. And I became really, really discouraged. And I felt like one day God came to me in a sense and said, not like audibly, but like internally, and just said, if I don't ever give that back to you, am I enough? And I'm like, no, no. And like, I mean, that was my honest answer. And I didn't like that it was my honest answer, but it was, God, I want you plus this, and then I'll be okay. And it was like He said to my spirit, now you see the work that we have to do. Like, you're sober now, you're not acting out anymore. Now we need to work on, you don't know who you are, apart from being up on a stage at a piano leading people in worship. And that's not who you are, that's just what you did. Just like your addiction is not who you are, that's just what you did. And so God began to redeem just my identity and to be enough that I was just His child. I don't need to be anything more than that, because everything else is just what I do. So I still had a desire to minister, because that's just kind of my wiring. But God, over the years, changed it and kind of rerouted it into a desire to walk with people who had been through what I had. I remembered how important it was when people came to me, and I wanted to be the guy that would go to them. And eventually, it turned into what is now Awaken. And I'm going to talk at the end about some of the things that we offer. But basically, just to let you know kind of what I plan to talk about in this time with healthy sexuality is, I don't know what you thought this was going to be coming in here. It's not going to be a talk on how to have more sex. It's not going to be a talk on why porn is so bad, although both of those are going to show up in this talk. It's not going to be, we're not going to talk about like technique or anything like that. That's not the kind of talk it is. The kind of talk that this is just to help us get, hopefully, a clearer and a more accurate and a more God-given view of our sexuality. Like, what is it? And so, yeah, with that in mind, kind of, who is this session for? Well, it's for y'all. But what I had in mind coming in here is, it's for men who have unwanted sexual struggles, men who are struggling with porn, with affairs, with unhealthy sexual fantasy or behavior. It's also for men who want to support their friends who struggle. You may have guys who have come to you and said, hey, I've got a real problem with this, and you don't know what to say. And sometimes you may not know what to say other than, so do I, right? But like, what do we do about that? But also men who want to help their sons, if you have sons, or if you one day will have sons, grow up with a healthy view of sexuality. Because I believe that a lot of men with broken sexual experiences have that because we never had help understanding what healthy sexuality could look like in the first place, right? We're trying to basically create something with no model. It's like trying to put together a model airplane without having any instructions, without even having the picture on the box, and just to figure it out. And I don't think that we have the capacity to do that. So if we want to do a better job with our sons than maybe was done for us, then this is a talk that hopefully will help with that. So I've given y'all this, and I'm not like off balance. This is on purpose. I left some margin on the right side of your paper in case you have a pen and want to jot anything down. And I also didn't put a bunch of blanks to fill in because I know some people don't like that and it can kind of take your attention away. So everything is already filled in for you. We'll just talk through it together, but there's some main points that we're going to cover, and then we're going to leave some time at the end just to discuss, and I'll just come sit down at the table and we can talk through things if you have questions. The first thing is our sexuality is good. The second point is going to be that our sexual experience is often broken. And the third point is that our sexuality can be repaired and redeemed. Those are the three things that we're going to talk about. And I wanted to start out with just something that may seem like an obvious statement, but it doesn't get a whole lot of airtime, and that is that our sexuality is a good, wonderful, positive thing. And so I want to just start with this question. How many of y'all, the four of y'all, grew up in church? All four of you. Okay. All of us grew up in church. All right. So I want you to think about your experience growing up in church. How many of you can remember growing up hearing consistently positive messages about sex in church? Nope. Okay. How many of you remember hearing something about sex in church or in youth group or in sermons? Yeah, I'm seeing yes and I'm seeing no, right? So most people who grow up in church don't hear consistently positive messages about sex from the church. I think we can all probably agree with that. So what are the messages that we hear typically? So sex is bad. Now, it may not be those words, but that's definitely what comes across, isn't it? Because it's referred to kind of with a negative vibe, yeah? Sex is dangerous. Right? Especially, I because of my age, I kind of grew up on the front end of what became like known as purity culture, true love waits and stuff like that. And every talk about sex is everything that could go horribly wrong if you do it right now. Sex is for later. Well, I think that's a good message, right? That's a part of the message. But what comes later? right? So here's the next part of the message. That's what most of us got, right? That's intentional. A lot of the time, we just have crickets. If we're looking to get positive messages about God's design for sexuality in church, we don't find it. Why do you think that is? Vulnerability doesn't come easy to men, and it doesn't come easy to leaders, because vulnerability is kind of synonymous with the word risk, right? If you make yourself vulnerable, then that is a risk because your vulnerability could get attacked, right? And so, like, we're afraid if we ask questions, then what if nobody else has those same questions? It's just me, and I'm embarrassed or shamed or made fun of. And for leaders, if I really engage with this, what if everybody in our church just starts having sex with everybody, right? And like, I'm afraid of everything that could go wrong, and I don't want to. Yeah, I think a lot of that drives it. The problem is we're trying to control something that God has the ability to control. And we don't do anybody any favors when we take something that God speaks about very favorably and we don't speak about it at all, or if we speak about it negatively. So most Christian sex education in the church or in Christian context is either non-existent or lacks positive messages. So what I mean by that is mostly it focuses on what to avoid. Don't have sex before you're married. Don't do too much with your girlfriend. Like, you can hold hands, but don't do, if you can kiss, but keep your tongue in your mouth, just whatever. And then so many of the messages are, well, where's the line? Like, tell me where the line is, that if I'm on this side of the line, it's okay, but if I'm on that side of the line, it's too far. And like, I'm going to go, if that's the line, I'm going to be leaning over the line. And we miss the point because we're focusing on what to avoid. This is a quote from a book called Unwanted by Jay Stringer. He says, few people receive comprehensive sex education, and most sex education, when it does take place, focuses on what to avoid. Hey, how about this? Try learning to cook if the only thing you ever learned about was food poisoning. I mean, that makes sense, doesn't it? Like, if you want to become a master chef and the only lesson is don't leave the chicken out or you'll get salmonella, or hey, clean that up, or don't put the stove on too much or you're going to burn it. Okay, but how do I do it right? You're telling me everything how to avoid doing it wrong, but you're not telling me how to do it right. And so much of the time, that's the approach that we take with sex. If I make it sound too good, then my son's going to want to do it right now. And that makes so much sense. And the thing I would throw into that conversation is, I've got a son who's 23. Like, do I not think he already wants to do it right now? And so somebody is going to be the informational authority on sex in my son's life. And my question that I have to be faced with is, do I want it to be me, or do I want it to be porn or the internet? Because somebody is going to be the source of information that's going to satisfy a young man's curiosity. I've got a good friend who has 2 teenage sons, and he was telling me about a conversation he had when they were 12 and 13, because he realized, like, they're at the age where their puberty's hitting, their bodies are changing, they've probably figured out masturbation, and they're not asking me any questions. Like, he had a few kind of early conversations. He's like, I wonder what they're doing in their quest to get info. So he just got with his sons and he said, hey, boys, I know y'all are interested in sexual things, but you're not asking me any questions. So when you have a curiosity, who do you talk to? And they're like, our friends. He says, okay, I'll make you a deal. He says, if you have any questions about sex, I want you to come talk to me, because I've had a lot more sex than your friends, and your mom says I'm really good at it. And they're like, ah! But at the same time, what he was doing is he was demystifying the whole thing. Yeah. He was making it okay to talk about. He was making it to where, like, we can be lighthearted about this. It's not going to just be like health class with my dad. It's going to be okay. So I think it's wonderful, but that concern is valid. And so I think that, and you mentioned having had the talk, and the way that you described it, it's not the way that most people describe the talk, because for most people the talk is either one awkward 5-minute conversation or no talk at all. It's just like putting a book on their pillow or something. But this doesn't need to just be a talk. This needs to be a series of ongoing conversations that starts much younger than most of us think is appropriate, and then grows along with their stages of development. And so that's just going to be new for a lot of us. We have to be willing to understand and talk about sex the way that God does. And how does He talk about it? Well, it's a gift. It's supposed to be experienced free from shame and regret, deeply pleasurable, experience within marriage, because that is the context in which we can most enjoy it. And it's a representation of His relationship with us as the church. And that's the one that probably doesn't resonate as much with young people because they just don't get that imagery yet, but we do later. And there's so much Scripture that talks about it. I mean, some of the Scriptures are right there. You can look those up later. But Song of Solomon, I don't know if you've ever listened to any messages or sermon series or whatever on Song of Solomon. Sometimes people will say, well, this is supposed to be a picture and a representation of Jesus and the church. I'm like, okay, but it was also poetry written to teach young Jewish boys how to sexually love their wives. It was basically a primer on learning how to be a good lover. That's what Song of Solomon is. And it is hot. I mean, if you read Song of Solomon, you understand what's in the subtext of some of the imagery that they use. It is really, really something. And so God's idea is not that we shy away from talking about sex, because it's a good thing. And a lack of good communication forces curious young people to get their information from sex elsewhere. And usually now, that's from porn. When I was young and I had a question about sex, we had a shelf of World Book encyclopedias. And man, the S volume, it was snakes or sex. I'd look at the pictures of snakes and get scared because I hated snakes. And I don't know why I did that to myself. But then I'd look at sex and I'd look at, because I was super curious about it. And there was this clinical encyclopedia explanation that didn't really answer my questions, but I just was fascinated in it, and I didn't feel like I could go to my parents and ask them. Because there wasn't a precedent set for that, and there wasn't the invitation to come. And so now, I thank God that I grew up in the 70s and 80s when there was no internet. I really don't know how you guys do it. And the thing is, there's so many people that their first exposure to pornography was involuntary. It was somebody turning their phone around or misspelling a website and something else coming up. And before you knew it, oh my gosh, what am I looking at? The way that it usually progressed for people my age was when you hit 11 or 12, you discover masturbation. And then a few years later, you see a porn magazine, and then that kind of integrates itself. Well, I'm talking to more and more young men who it's the other way around. And they've never experienced masturbation without pornography. It's always been porn, and some of them have seen porn as young as 5 or 6 years old. The average age of first exposure to hardcore pornography now is somewhere around 8 or 9 years old. And an 8 or 9-year-old brain is not able to process what it's seeing, but the body still responds. Things happen in the brain and things happen in the body, and it's pleasurable, and so it hooks you before you're able to really have a chance of fighting against it. And so now when porn is willing to say, hey, I'll be the sex ed teacher, man, I'll tell you anything you want to know. The problem is we don't know that it's all lies. The message that porn gives us about sex is all lies. So our sexuality is a good thing. I don't want us to start off on any other foot than that. The desires that we have for sex are good. If you're 19 years old and you want to have sex, everything is working the way it's supposed to. It's not bad that you want to have sex. It's good that you want to have sex. And there's nothing to feel guilty or ashamed of that you want to have sex. That is something like everything else in our lives that we could abuse or misuse, that God wants us to put under His control. Part of the fruit of the Spirit is self-control, but how do we control ourselves? By letting God be the one who's in control. And that's not an easy thing to do, because sometimes it just feels like if I wait, my junk's going to explode. And that's just a reality. It feels that way sometimes, but it becomes a way that we can really lean into and trust God. But when we don't always do that, That's what part 3 of this talk is about, so we'll get to that. So the part in the middle, though, is our sexual experience is often broken. So what forms does this brokenness take? And when I say broken, I just mean we're deviating from the way that it was designed to be experienced. Pornography is an obvious way. Sexual activity outside of a marriage relationship. Sexual abuse. There is so much sexual abuse that's going on, and it's often tied to a person's experience with porn, because pornography portrays sex in a very aggressive and violent way, much more so than it used to. In fact, there's a study that was done of mainstream pornography, and this study is now 15 years old. This was done in 2007, where they basically just took about 50 titles from mainstream pornography videos that you could rent or buy, and this is before Pornhub even existed, and they just randomly picked some scenes, and they found that 88% of the scenes that they watched had some kind of violent act in them, whether it was smacking, choking, slapping, and 95% of the targets of the aggression were women. And so the message of porn is men dominate women, and women like it, because most of the victims of the aggression, the way that they were filmed was either enjoying it or being okay with it. There was no protest and there was no equity. And so that's the message that porn portrays, and it's just such an easy thing to buy into, especially when it's your first exposure to any sexual information. You don't know any different. So where did this come from? Like, what's the source of the brokenness? Well, a lot of times curiosity is where it starts, right? Nothing wrong with that. We were born to be inquisitive. False beliefs or messages such as, well, there's nothing wrong with this. It doesn't hurt anybody. I can stop whenever I want, right? It's true until it's not. But this is a big one, difficult or traumatic childhood experiences. Now, here's what I mean by that. I believe that anytime you've got a person who is addicted to sex or pornography, you can look back in their story, and if you could see their story with clarity, you're going to find trauma. You've got a lot of people who look at porn who don't get addicted to it. And a lot of them, you're going to find fewer traumatic experiences in their lives. There is something that goes along with that. When we have unresolved trauma from our childhood that we carry with us, that creates this pressure in our lives and in our emotions that feels like we're holding a beach ball underwater. If you've ever been in a swimming pool and held an inflated beach ball under the water, see how long you can do it? At first, it's easy, right? What happens after a few minutes? Gets heavy, gets real heavy, right? And eventually, right? And so when it feels like the pressure is just going to become too much, what we do is we go to something to relieve the pressure. And a lot of times that's sexual acting out. And it becomes compulsive. I want to show you something here. This is something that a sex therapist from England named Paula Hall came up with. She calls it the OAT model for addictions, because there's 3 words that start with OAT. And she's seeking to answer the question, what is it experientially that contributes to people becoming addicted to porn or addicted to sex? Well, the O is opportunity. And this is represented right here, because everybody who gets addicted had the opportunity to. If you didn't have the opportunity, you couldn't get addicted to it, right? If you're an alcoholic, it's because you had access to alcohol. So the opportunity is the first thing. But opportunity alone is not enough, because like I said a minute ago, there are people who use pornography or who have sex early in their life and they don't become addicted to it. So what is it that makes it different for some than others? Well, there's a second experience that stands for the A, and we're going to have that as like this overlay. And these are people who had unhealthy attachment. Now, when I say attachment, that's kind of a psychological term, and it's really referring to experiences that we have in the first 5 or so years of our lives. If you've ever heard people talking about, like, man, that child just didn't seem to be really securely attached. Or if you know anybody who has adopted children from an international context, and they're like, they have severe attachment issues because the first couple of years of their lives in an orphanage, they just didn't get held a lot, or they didn't get a lot of attention. Well, when we're young and vulnerable, we need our parents to hold us, to provide for our needs, to look at us, to have eye contact, to have love and physical and emotional connection with us. And when we don't have that with consistency, along with other things like they notice our emotions and they know how to respond to them, and they help us regulate our emotions. Like when we're bouncing off the ceiling, they'll sit us down and hold us and calm us down. When we're sluggish, they'll take us outside and get us active. They teach us how to do those things. If we don't have that with consistency, then we're going to have some insecure attachment. And that can show up in how we relate in different ways later in life. Well, if you have opportunity and attachment, these people are going to be more likely to use sex in an unhealthy or an addictive way. Does that make sense? So there's a third experience that starts with a T. We're going to show it that way. That's trauma. Now, when I say trauma, what came to your mind?
Something physical, like you have a broken arm.
Yeah, like getting in an accident, breaking your arm. Absolutely, that's trauma. Some severe, like sexual trauma, would be like being molested or being raped. Being in an accident where you see someone else die. You know, that's typically what we think of as trauma, something physical or something instant or event-based or really huge. And we like to kind of refer to those as big T traumas, like shock or event trauma. And not all of us had that, but most all of us had what we call little t trauma, which is something that we are able to survive, but it just creates this flinch or this uncertainty in us, and it's day after day after day. Like one example is this buddy of mine who's a therapist. Well, that's probably a big T example. Let me give you a different one. Say you're 5 years old and you're playing with friends and you're playing hide and seek and you go hide in a closet and the door closes behind you and it gets stuck. Pitch black, you're scared of the dark, you can't get out, you're terrified, you think you're going to die. 30 seconds later, somebody comes and opens the door, you get out. Whew, right? You don't really remember that all the time, but your system does. And your system learned a lesson that day. Never, ever, ever again do what? Get in a closet, right? And so 20 years later, you're going to a meeting at an office building, and you go into the lobby, you get in the elevator, and right before the doors close, 7 people get in and they crowd around you, the doors close. All of a sudden, cold sweat, panic attack. Why is that happening? Because something about this reminds you of that. Because trauma is stored in the body. And even if it's a little t that was not like a devastating event that we consciously remember, our systems remember it. And all of us have little t trauma of some sort. It can be pressure to perform. It could be having someone in our family with an addiction or an anger problem. It could be playing for a coach that is always going to criticize, and so we're just like waiting for the other shoe to drop. It can be all kinds of things that we just think of as normal because we just have to live with it, right? And we survive, but it does take a toll. And so when we have opportunity, attachment, insecurity, and trauma, you got some people who live in this space, and those are prime candidates for checking out and using their sexuality in an unhealthy way to try to fix all of the other stuff, often that we're not even aware is there. Does that make sense? Like if it just feels too much, if you come home at the end of a day and it's like, man, I've been holding it together, and now like my brain cannot wait to go get in the shower, right? Take my phone in the bathroom and just take care of business. And over time, our brains adapt to that and become expectant of it. That's the other thing about addiction. So where does it lead? Relationship problems. Porn creates unrealistic expectations about sex. Like, I can have it whenever I want it. Porn normalizes or contributes to sexual abuse because we do what we see. And porn is often connected to the destruction and breakup of marriages and relationships. So a lot of younger men who have used porn from a very young age get married in their mid-20s having no idea that this is going to give them an incredible handicap to being able to show up healthy for their wives. They think that honeymoon sex is going to be like porn sex. And their wives are like, what are you trying to do, right? Because although there are women who use porn and more than there used to be, it's still something that men have used much more of and more consistently. So we don't know that it's going to cause a problem often until it's causing a problem. Where else does it lead? Physiological problems. Misusing our sexuality actually takes a toll on our brains and our bodies, and here's what I mean. Porn conditions the brain to accept what's called supernormal stimuli as normal, literally rewiring the brain's responses. Here's what I mean by supernormal stimulation. Oh, I'll get to that in a minute. It can also cause ejaculation problems, either premature ejaculation or just like, it just doesn't come. Porn-induced erectile dysfunction. Porn-induced ED is on the rise. I don't know if y'all listen to the radio, but have you noticed a lot of Alabama men's clinic commercials on, and a lot of little blue pills? They're talking about ED all the time. Hymns, Romans, men's clinics. Like, it's not because everybody's turning 50 and they are marketing to young men. There's a study done at the University of Washington about 10 years ago. The average age of the participant in the study was 25. It was 600 men, average age of 25, who identified as heavy porn users. Of those men, almost 70% of them had reported that they had experienced erectile dysfunction when they were trying to have sex with a partner, and 0% when they were using porn. Their brains knew what to do with a screen, but their brains did not know what to do with a woman, because they had so conditioned themselves to where this is what sex is. The brain and the body has a real live woman there saying, what am I supposed to do here? Right? It's a real thing, and I was about to say it's on the rise. But the problem is, when we have a pharmaceutical solution to the problem, we're just allowing people to go deeper and deeper and deeper into something that's going to be more destructive. Hypofrontality is one more thing. Here's what that is in a nutshell. There are different systems in our brain that do different things, right? So the pleasure center is the part of the brain that produces chemicals, hormones, neurotransmitters that get active when we start getting aroused and kind of help our sexual experience. The prefrontal cortex, which is the part up here, is the part that makes good rational decisions, right? So the part of your brain that wants to do fun things is one of the first parts to fully develop. The part that makes smart decisions is one of the last parts to fully develop, which is one of the reasons why teenage boys drive 100 miles an hour and they think that nothing's going to happen to them. Because it's fun and, well, I'm not going to lose control, right? We don't have the ability when we're young to make as good of decisions as when we're older. But when we are older and we're using porn all the time, repeated use of pornography basically has a damaging effect on our prefrontal cortex. It's the equivalent, the brain equivalent of like riding your brakes too hard and wearing out your brake pads. If you wear out your brake pads, what's eventually going to happen when you hit the brakes? It's not going to slow down, right? And so what you end up having happen is people that seem rational making really dumb decisions. You remember during Me Too when there was that story about Matt Lauer having the button under his desk, that when a female staffer would come in, he'd hit that button, the door would close, he'd take his penis out? Who does that? Who thinks that's a good idea? Well, maybe somebody who's been altered because of extended misuse of their sexuality. So hypofrontality is another thing. So let's dig in just a tiny bit more to that. What is happening in our brain when we're aroused? So this graph right here demonstrates basically a normal human sexual arousal cycle. Okay, and so here's what this is talking about. From bottom to top, this is a measurement of the level of sexual intensity. This is nothing, and this is orgasm. So the first triad here is kind of the build-up. That's when we become aware of sexual appetite. The second here is when we're having the experience. That's the consumption of sex. And then the third is satiation, which just means we're satisfied. That's the aftermath. So there's the build-up, there's having sex, and then there's afterwards. Got me? And so within that, there's basically some different phases. I become aware of desire. I get more excited as I get closer to it. I have a plateau of the experience. It ends in orgasm, and then there's a resolution. So this is what it's kind of supposed to look like in a healthy relationship. And so when that's happening, in that first phase of appetite, our brains are releasing dopamine and norepinephrine. Now everybody's heard of dopamine, right? Dopamine is something that just gives you focus. It helps you fixate on your goal and what you want. And God put dopamine in our brains to be produced basically at an instinctive level to help us survive. Because two of the activities where the most dopamine are released are eating and having sex. Well, if we don't eat, we're going to die. And if we don't have sex, the human race dies out, right? So it makes sense that things like that are pleasurable, that we want to do again and again and again, are going to have those releases. And norepinephrine, what does that sound like? Does that remind you of anything? What about this part right there, epi? EpiPen does what? Saves you. Like if you go into anaphylactic shock, what's going to happen to your heart? Your heart rate's going to stop or slow down way too much. EpiPen pumps adrenaline into your heart and it gets it beating faster. So have you ever been turned on, you feel your heart start to race? That's the norepinephrine. So then when you get into a sexual experience, whether that is masturbation, whether that's having sex with another person, and you have an orgasm, your brain releases oxytocin and vasopressin. Those are both bonding chemicals. So whenever you give a hug to a good buddy of yours or have any kind of skin-on-skin contact, your brain releases oxytocin because that activity makes you feel close to the person, right? Mothers who breastfeed babies, strong release of oxytocin in both the mother and the baby's brains. They call it the mother-child bond. When you're having an orgasm with a partner, strong rush of oxytocin, because God's design is that is supposed to be the closest physically intimate experience you can have with another person. And when it's your spouse, that's perfect. That's exactly how everything is supposed to be, right? And vasopressin has actually been associated with the preference of partners. So like in people or animals who have multiple sexual partners, they've somehow measured that in the partners that they have sex with more, there's higher levels of vasopressin, meaning the more often you're with a certain partner, the more you will come to prefer that partner. So like objectively, if you had two girls that you were sleeping with, and this one, most people would say is prettier, but this one you have sex with more often, you're actually going to find this one more attractive chemically because of that. And so think about if the partner that you have is that right there. That's going to be the partner that your brain prefers. And that's where some of the other problems come in, right? So then, after the orgasm has taken place, your brain releases prolactin and serotonin. Serotonin helps you feel calm, peaceful. Prolactin actually makes you sleepy. Like the stereotype is, after sex, women want to talk and men want to roll over and go to sleep, because guess which gender's brain releases more prolactin? The guys, right? So it's not just because men are being jerks that they want to roll over and go to sleep. It's kind of naturally what's physically happening in their brain. And so it's intended to bring calmness and satisfaction and well-being. Thinking about this, like you younger guys who aren't married yet, imagine getting married and having an experience like this with your wife, where there's no guilt, there's no secrets, there's no shame, there's no hiding. That sounds pretty awesome, doesn't it? Right? And the guys who are married, like, that sounds pretty awesome. And I've experienced that with my wife when there was a secret, and now that there's not. And I'll tell you something, doing it according to the design is so much better sex, right? When you can experience that way. But think about this if you've got a lot of experience with using porn. So take that and overlay that with what happens in the chemical releases of somebody who binges on porn all the time, and it looks more like this. This is what we mean by supernormal stimulation. If you have this much continuing input of dopamine and norepinephrine, and you just keep that going for a long time because you know that as soon as you're done, you're going to feel like garbage, too much of it for too long, that's your supernormal stimulation. And when we do that for long enough, the brain no longer interprets normal sexuality as being arousing. This doesn't even register anymore. It's got to be more and for longer. Like there's a lot of guys who will have all night or hours long porn binges. I gotta tell you, sex doesn't last hours. Sex lasts minutes. And it's supposed to. It's not, people are, oh, we did it all night long. No, you didn't. You did it and then you went to sleep and you may have woken up again, but you don't do it all night long. That's just not how it works. And so when that happens, your brain is conditioned to expect that. And with that conditioning comes some problems. A disinterest in having relationships because it's just easier to use porn. There's no vulnerability because you don't have to put yourself out there. Abnormal or unhealthy sexual practices like porn mimicking behavior. You'll want to do things that you see in porn the way that you see them in porn. So violence or aggression or even assault. And then the physiological effects that we talked about, like the porn-induced erectile dysfunction, the premature delayed ejaculation, or the hypofrontality. So that's what can happen. And where does it also lead? Emotional problems. If you've got that going on and you realize that now that you're trying to pursue relationship and it's causing all these problems, isolation, withdrawal, anxiety, depression. There are people who will quit sports, quit activities that they like because it's just easier to stay home and be on your devices all the time. Isolation is part of the problem because men, we were created to be connected. And sexual addiction is an intimacy disorder. Sexual addiction is not about sex. Because if you could fix it by having enough sex, a lot of addicts wouldn't have any problem with what they were doing. But sex is not the problem. Sex is the attempted solution to a deeper problem is I don't feel connected to anybody. I don't feel connected to God, myself, or people around me. And so you can't fix an intimacy problem in isolation. Definition, it doesn't work. Intimacy has to involve at least two people. And when I say intimacy, I'm not talking about just sexual intimacy. That's only one kind of intimacy. There's so many more kinds of intimacy. Like there's intimacy that you guys have as father and son. And that's not gross because intimacy is just being close. It's allowing yourself to be seen and to see and to be known and to know. And so there are some kinds of intimacy that we're only supposed to have with other men. Some types of intimacy that we have with siblings, with parents, with friends. And then there's one type of intimacy that we're meant to have with our wife. And only her. And so when we are finding intimate connections in healthy ways, then that's going to be a part of how we come out of this. But a misuse of our sexuality, the brokenness of our sexuality manifests in trouble for our relationships, trouble in our bodies, and trouble in our emotions. But the good news, I don't want to leave you like, this is part 1, part 2, part 3, right? Any good movie trilogy kind of follows a pattern, right? The first one is setting things up, the second one's where it gets really dark, and the third one's where everything works out in the end, right? So the third part is that our sexuality can be repaired and redeemed. This is the good news, because no matter how far down the scale you've gone, it's not too far. You know how I know that? Because you're still breathing air. And as long as we're still breathing air, there's still opportunity. Your sexual brokenness, first off, does not define you. It's really important to realize that, I'll just put it up here. Who I am is not what I've done. Who I am is not what I've done, but it feels like that sometimes, doesn't it? When we've done that thing again that we said we weren't going to do, inevitably we're going to start to think, I guess that's just who I am. And if it's just who I am, then I might as well just dive in. Because what other choice do I have? And we get really hopeless. But who I am is not what I've done. Who I am is who Christ says I am. And this is a really important distinction here, because if we're not in Christ, then there are some things that we need to first and foremost and primarily deal with, right? But if we have come to understand my sin, the status where that puts me in relation to God, what Jesus did, and I trust in Him and I accept His gift of salvation, then I've been brought into His family. And everything has changed. And so who does Christ say I am if I'm in Him? Well, this is what Ephesians says. You were dead in your trespasses and sins in which you previously walked according to the ways of the world, according to the rule of the power of the air, the spirit now working the disobedient, that's Satan. We too all previously lived among them in our fleshly desires, carrying out the inclinations of our flesh and thoughts, and we were by nature children of wrath as the others were also. So what I do was who I am, or a reflection of who I am, but God, who is rich in mercy, because of His great love that He had for us, made us alive with Christ, even though we were dead in trespasses. Even if you haven't stopped looking at porn, you're saved by grace. And it seems like it's hard to hold space for both of those things, but if you're in Christ, it's true. He also raised us up with Him and seated us with Him in the heavens in Christ Jesus, so in the coming ages He might display the immeasurable riches of His grace through His kindness to us in Christ Jesus. For you are saved by grace through faith. This is not from yourselves, it's God's gift, not from works, so that no one can boast. For we are His workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared ahead of time for us to do. So my belief is, men, when we are acting out, misusing our sexuality, sexually sinning, having this broken behavior, if we're in Christ, we are forgetting who we are. And we're acting like who we used to be. Because that has gone back with us for so long. We've carried that exile, a part of us, for so long, it's just easy to go back to. And we've forgotten who we are. I've talked to so many men who just say, I just don't know how I could be a Christian if I keep doing this. And I'll say, well, I want to ask you a question. What do you feel like when you act out to porn right after you finish ejaculating? They're like, that's kind of a weird question. I'm like, tell me what you feel like. Like, I feel like garbage. I'm like, that's how it makes me confident that you're a Christian. The fact that it bothers you, it's the Holy Spirit and your spirit telling you this is not how it's supposed to be. When it stops bothering you is when I'm going to worry. So the fact that you're even asking this question may be a reason for you to have confidence that the relationship is really there. And so the question isn't get saved over and over again. It is be confident in the work that He has already done and start trusting in that. But how do we do that? Can't do it by ourselves. We've already talked about this isolation thing is no bueno, right? We got to remember that also our sexual brokenness is no worse than other sins. It may have different consequences, but the same restoration and forgiveness is offered by God. It's important for us to know that when I'm married, if I cheat on my wife, that's going to have different consequences than if I say something ugly to my wife. Both are sin. Jesus sees them the same. My wife is not going to see them the same. And she shouldn't. Different sins have different consequences, but when God is involved, all of those were sins that Jesus died for. And so it's not that they're not serious. It's not that we don't need to get the help that we need for them, but we don't need to say, well, so-and-so's a better Christian than me because all they do is lose their temper sometime, but I cheat on my wife. James says that if you've kept the whole law and broken it in one area, you've broken the whole law. And so we got to quit the comparisons. Here's another good news feature is the physiological damage done can be reversed. God created us with something called neuroplasticity. Okay? Neuro, meaning it involves what part of the body? The brain. Plasticity sounds like what? Plastic. What do we know about plastic as opposed to stone? Plastic is more pliable and can be molded, right? And so if something plastic doesn't work out, you just melt it down and you can form it again. Well, there's a sense in which that's the way God designed the brain. Our brains have millions of neural pathways and connections that get made. When you do an experience over and over again, when you have a repeated experience, you're creating a neural pathway in your brain. And it's like carving this channel, right? It's like water that forms a little rut and then a ditch and then a canyon. The more you do it, the deeper that goes and the more natural it becomes. You don't even have to think about it anymore. So pornography is like that. It gets to where like you just like your brain knows what's coming and it's on autopilot. But the brain is also created with a sense of use it or lose it. And so if you are asking for help in getting out of that habit and you're creating a new neural pathway, what's going to happen eventually to the old one? It's going to fill in. Think about it like if you had a path that you walked through the woods every day for 10 years, but then you started walking a different way through the woods. What's going to happen here over time? Wear down a new path. What's going to happen to that old path? It's going to grow over. Because we do have a lot of neural pathways, but we do have a limited amount. And so that space will get commandeered and repurposed for something else. And so even though it seems like when the urge hits, I can't say no, one day that could be different. The brain is created to heal itself. Now, how long it takes varies from person to person. Typically speaking, neuroplasticity is more active in younger people than it is with older people. So you'd think that young porn addicts will heal faster. That's not always the case, because older people who become addicted to porn had an original kind of sexual arousal template that was attached to reality, because we didn't have porn. So when we stop using porn, we have breadcrumbs to follow back to what we originally learned. A lot of young men, porn is what they learned about sex. And so when you stop using porn, it's like I'm floating in space. Like I don't have anything to go back to. I kind of have to reinvent the wheel. So it might take a while, but it will happen. And we need support from other people while we're healing. And I say we need it from community, through counseling, and from the church. And we've already talked about how it can be difficult or tricky with the church, because if we go to a church where this doesn't get talked about, we can't just get our help from the church. The church can support us. They can come alongside us. They can speak the gospel and speak the truth to us, but we also need a community of people who understands this firsthand. When Chet was talking about how he goes to the support group for parents who have lost children, he's like, if you haven't lost a child, you don't know what it's like. You can't help me in that way. And that's absolutely true. So a lot of times it can be very helpful to get support from other people who have had the same type of sexual struggle that you have, because they get it and they understand. And they can give you the kind of grace from firsthand experience that other people can't. And then counseling is going to help you get to the bottom of your story, to the roots of your story, and understand kind of like, what are those early life experiences that I never knew were connected to what I'm doing now? That maybe if I can experience the healing from those wounds, then it's not going to continue to have the same effect. Does that make sense? So your sexual brokenness and the healing particularly can become an amazing story of God's grace and power in your life. The thing that you thought would be the death of you could be a way to come alive and to help others come alive. Listen to this scripture. Don't you know the unrighteous will not inherit God's kingdom? Don't be deceived. No sexually immoral people, idolaters, adulterers, males who have sex with males, no thieves, greedy people, drunkards, verbally abusive people, or swindlers will inherit God's kingdom. I know, I'm awful. I'm not going to... And some of you used to be like this, but you were washed. You were sanctified. You were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and by the Spirit of our God. That is not who you are. It's who you were. It's what you did. But then God did what He did. And there's no limit to what can happen if we lean into that. From 2 Corinthians, blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies, the God of all comfort. This is so cool, y'all. He comforts us in all our afflictions so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any kind of affliction through the comfort we ourselves receive from God. This is Paul saying that when you've been through something, you're going to be able to use that to help people who are going through that same something. Isn't that cool? We have received comfort from God. I received comfort from other people, and then I was able to pass it along and give comfort. And I never thought I'd have that chance. When I was in the crater at square one, ground zero of my, what we call fan day, because it's the day that you know what hits the fan, right? I never thought I would be able to be used in anybody's life ever again. But it happened. The fact that I couldn't see it did not limit what God could do. I didn't think 13 and a half years ago that on a Friday night in July of 2022, I'd be a part of this, sharing with some guys about how God had redeemed and healed my sexuality. That was not on the radar, but here it is. So what do I do now? Can't have a talk like this and not give you some, next steps, right? So if if you are in that first group of people, to some extent, somebody who has an unwanted sexual struggle, or who want to be able to support, or who want to help your sons, or all three, because a lot of us are all three, right? First thing is be honest about how serious it is. Those false messages, I'm not hurting anybody, I can stop whenever I want to, there's nothing wrong with it. We gotta stop lying to ourselves. We gotta quit minimizing. We gotta be honest about how serious it is. We gotta commit to share your struggle with somebody. Not everybody. Everybody's not safe. Probably in our lives, all of us have hopefully at least one person that we can think of as the safest person in my life. And if we don't, then there are anonymous recovery meetings, and you can find safe people there. But commit to share your struggle with someone. Ask for help. That is the name of the game. We cannot do this on our own, and it's not because there's something wrong with us. It's because none of us can make life work on our own. There's a verse in Philippians 2 that a lot of us know that have been used in a lot of sermons to guilt people into better behavior. And it says, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, right? And then we stop. But that's not where the verse stops. It says, for you know that God works in you to will and to act for His good pleasure. So what that's saying is, God is like saying, here's your job. You can't do this job. Well, crap. Right? No. Let me finish. What's more, you can't even want to do this job. Well, crap. Like you're setting me up. No. Let me finish. I'm going to give you the desire, and I'm going to do it. Your obedience is me doing the work. So what's your job? Let me. Your job is get out of the way and surrender. Ask for help. Ask for my help. Get help from other people. And that can be the hardest thing to do, but it's the only thing that's going to turn this tide and have it go another way. So real quickly, just one of the ways that Awaken helps men and women who are going through things like this is we have community for men, and then separate communities for women who have sexual struggles. And then we also have for women who are experience betrayal trauma, meaning they're the partners of a man who struggles. We've got in-person meetings in Nashville, Cullman, Birmingham, Montgomery, Prattville. But we also have virtual meetings for people who don't live close to an in-person meeting. We've got intensives called the Roots Retreat for men who are ready to dive deeper into understanding their addiction and how the trauma fueled it and how to pursue recovery. We do those 3 times a year. We've got flyers over here where you can find out more about it on our website. These are therapist-led. They're deep dives. They last a Thursday through a Sunday. It's immersive. You turn your phone in and it is like we are doing heavy lifting work, and it's amazing. We also have workshops for women who want to heal from sexual betrayal, also called the Roots Retreat, but this one's the women's workshop. We have cohorts for ministry leaders who want to learn more about this because they're going to be the ones shepherding people. If you have any form of leadership in your church and you want other leaders to know about it, I've got some flyers on our cohorts that you could give to your leaders. We have one cohort running now. We meet once a month for a half a day with church leaders, and we just talk about a lot of elements dealing with pornography, recovery, trauma, and we help them become better equipped to know what they're doing better in helping people. We're going to be looking to start another one this fall. We offer coaching, which is sort of like counseling, more life coaching approach for men, women, and couples who need guidance and encouragement. And we also we provide referrals to licensed therapists if that's where you are in your journey and you need to do that type of work. And so you can go to the website or email us if you have any specific questions about that or you want to follow up with it.